Hello, today we're going to be going over how to create a filtered list in Flow, which will use a looping architecture. So first thing we're going to need to do is figure out what we need to build. So in this case, we're going to be building a sample data list, but we also want to give the users the ability to filter that data from buttons. So at the top of the table, we want to have a few buttons that allow them to select a filter, and then once filtered, we want them to be able to show all again. Within Flow, you can already do this with a database or service showed within a table, but when you're dealing with lists individually or you're putting lists together from other data sources, you don't get that ability. So you need to create all of this within Flow on its own. So we'll need to build a few things first in order to make this work. We're going to create an example list type, which will act as sort of like a profile if you're familiar with Atom. For the example list, types basically work as objects that have certain parameters, and then you create instances of those that are values within the system. So next thing we're going to have is the example list data. This will be an instance list or a value list that is of the example list type that we just created, and this will contain our actual source data. Filtered selected is going to hold what our current filter that we have selected. This will be set by an operator that will push in based on which button you click on. And then finally, there's the filtered list, which will contain the actual final filtered list data that will display only those items that you want to display based on the filter. So with that, let's get building. Okay, so what I've done just to save a little time is I've already created a very simple page that has a list within it. That list has a type or is utilizing a type of example list. That only has a name and color property selected to each. And then as values of that list for our example list data, I've added a bunch of names and a bunch of colors so that we have just something that we can filter through. So if we go back to our page and click play, you'll want to get up to this point before you continue. You just create a new table or a new type and a value of that type in a list format, and then include each of these items. You can do whatever you'd like for this as example, but I've just done it as names and then colors. So if we go back over to our flow, the main thing that you're going to need to do from this point is to give the options for the user as to what the filter is going to be. And then we're going to need to go through a looping architecture to compare each of those or compare the filter to each of the items within the list, and then only put the items into a new list that match the criteria. So first step we're going to do is we're going to move over 3 operators. These 3 operators will be for each of the filters. So filter red, and this operator is going to be using, I created a string called filter selected. So you would just create a new value, string, filter selected, and I'm going to set that equal to value of. And again, I created some static strings just so that I had them available. So the string on this one is red, correct? It must be red. Let me edit this. Yep. Static string red. So all that is a completely static string with the default value of red so that we can set the filter to red from what we selected. So this first operator is just setting the filter selected string to a static string value of red. We're going to be doing the same thing for blue and yellow. So again, I go down to my filter selected, set equal to value of, and blue. I've already created a static string for blue, so you would just create a new static string and have it there. Save. And operator would be filter yellow. And then we'll link these up. And I'm just setting their appearance to show at the top of the page, at the top of the table that we had created. Okay, so now if we run our flow, you're going to see that we have red, blue, and yellow at the top and our list. So now, after we've selected what we were going to filter by, we're going to need to actually go into the functions that will create the list. So first thing I'm going to do is actually create a clear list function or operator. This is going to be clearing the data out of the list we're about to create. And the reason why I do that first is because if you come back into the list after already creating one, you don't want it to add on to the existing list. You want it to start a brand new filtered list. So in this, we're going to create our example list filtered. And that will be a list, and it's going to be selected the example type. And click Save. And what we're going to be doing is emptying that. So all that's doing is clearing the existing values. So we're going to go Done, because after each of these, it will complete the first operation and now move on to this second operation. All three go into the same spot. And this acts as a starting point for our loop. So next up, we're going to be adding the first value, or taking the first value from the list that we have and adding it into an object that we can use to compare. So I'm going to place a new object or operator, and we're going to get next item. And new operator, we're going to create a new value on this one, and this will be example list builder object. And this is going to be an object, and it will be of the example list type. Now, the reason I've done this is the type basically gives you a few options. So the type itself is basically an object, and then a list is multiple objects in basically an array. So when you create a single object, you can push one of those list rows into this object and then use that to compare to. So that's what we're doing here, is we're creating a builder object that is used as a comparison tool. And then if this item matches our filter result, we push that into our new list and generate the new list using that. So I'm now going to save this option. And what I'm going to do is set equal to the first record, or the next record, excuse me, from the list that we've created. So our example list data. So if I click apply operation and save operator, okay, yeah, the next one is decision shape. So the next one, what we have to do here is actually create is done question mark. It's going to have two outcomes. One is if it's done, it's going to display the list. If it's not done, then it needs to move on to actually filtering that object. The reason why we check it here is because at this point we may have pulled an empty record and there's no reason to continue. So this is going to go from here to here, and then from here to either displaying the table over here or actually doing the loop logic and moving on. So let's go ahead and drag a page over so we have our final step, example filtered list. And I will create a new page, call it example filtered list, save it, drag my table on over, and we're going to be selecting the type as example list, but this list value is going to be our filtered value. We also need to add our columns as we always do. Okay, save the page, close the page, save the page. So now we have sort of our starting point of our loop and our ending point of our loop. So the next part of this logic is going to be one, it's going to be going ahead and doing the comparison, and then if it is the right, if it matches our filter, there'll be another operator actually added to the list, or if it doesn't, it'll just go to get the next item. So next thing we're going to do is another decision shape, and this is going to be is filtered item. And then finally, an operator for add to filtered list. Okay, so now we have our loop structure. And what we're going to do now is start to fill in the business logic that goes on to this. So, okay, so now that we have our basic structure, we're going to have to link everything up and get the business rules working to get this loop working. So first, let's go ahead and connect our clear list to get next item. So that just takes us to getting the next item in the list, and then this will take us to our first comparison. So on is done, we're going to create two outputs, one for yes, and this output is going to be checking whether or not the item that we just created, the example list builder object, is empty or not. So if empty equals true, so example list builder object is empty equals true, then move on as yes. If it does not equal true, then we're going to move on as no. In this case, we don't have to give a business rule because it'll just take the second one in the chain as the default when it's like an else. So next we have to check if it is the filtered item. And if it is the filtered item, add to the list. So again, I'll do a yes and create new rule compare. And we're going to be looking at whether or not the item that we had just collected, so the example filter or example list builder object color. We're using the builder object because that's what we're using as a comparison tool, and whether or not that equals the filter that we had created just a moment ago. So that's going to be the filter selected. So we've got example list builder object color. If it equals the filter selected, then we move on to adding it to the filtered list. And again, we'll create a default of no, and this will catch any exceptions to that rule and send it along the no path. Finally, we're going to go ahead and complete the loop and have it go back to get the next item. So once it's done adding it to the list, it's going to go done and complete the loop. At this point, I also have to add in what this operator is going to be, so we haven't yet added it to the list. So I'm going to select. I'm going to go and take the list that we have, the example list filtered. I'm going to update, and the reason you use update is because it will add or create a new item with the value of, and then this example list builder object. Apply. Now finally, I'm also going to, right after I added it, clear the builder object. So I'm just setting it to empty, and all that does is first it adds it to my list and then it empties it out. That way that we can do a proper comparison on whether or not the next item is in fact empty or not. So save the operator. Now you have your little loop that goes through. So it's going to first go clear list, which just is clearing the filtered list. So you're starting off with a new filter. It's checking, it's getting the next item from the data source list. It's then checking whether or not that new item from the data source list is empty or not. If it is empty, then we've completed our loop. If it isn't empty, then we need to check if it's the filtered item. If it is the filtered item, then we need to add it to our new filtered list and return to the beginning of the loop. At this point, it pulls the next record, and if it's done, it'll move on to display. If it's not, it'll move back on to checking the filter and running through the loop until it's gone through all records. So let's see if this works or not. So it does. So all we've done is created this, and let's add in a little bit of extra user interface. So we're going to drag from the very last step all the way back to the first step. Hopefully this works. There we go. And then show all, we'll call this, because it's actually going to take all the entries and show them again. And I'll drag this to the bottom so it's nice and clean. And so let's run this again. So let's run. We've now got our full list. Filter by yellow, only get the yellow results. Show all, only get the blue results. Or red results, excuse me, and blue. So that completes creating a very simple filter system and looping architecture.